anyway, The Man Who Fell to Earth is this week's cult film.
Yeah, and came out in 1976, made in 1975. Historically important because it was the first British film to be made in America with entirely British funding, so it was something of a breakthrough movie. Starred David Bowie. There is a very sort of weird tradition of rock stars in movies. Generally, rock stars in movies aren't very good. Nic Roeg, however, had a habit of casting rock stars correctly in movies. He'd worked with Mick Jagger in performance and actually got a very good performance out of him by casting him as Mick Jagger, effectively. Right. Okay, so for the Man Who Fell to Earth, the story is based on a science fiction novel by Walter Tevis, and the story is that there is a guy from outer space whose planet is dying because there is no water. He comes down to Earth in order to either get water back to Earth or to find a way of transporting his people down to Earth. It's never quite made clear. What happens is he doesn't have any emotion when he arrives on Earth, and he becomes sucked in, one, by human emotion, and secondly, by consumerism. And rather than trying to get his act together to go back to his planet and go back to his original wife and kids, he becomes, in the film, he becomes an alcoholic, and he becomes completely lethargic, and he gets dragged down by the sort of awfulness of human existence. At the same time, he falls in love with a human being, and it all goes horribly wrong.
It's bad luck for the planet, isn't it? Like, they choose someone to save their world, send him down to find water, and he just goes out on the piss for like 3 months. It's bad luck, that, really, isn't it?
Exactly what happens. Just two things. This is from Nic Roeg. This is the serious stuff, because although now we kind of look back on this film as kind of camp classic to some extent, it was taken very seriously at the time. For a start, it was an X-certificate movie, so it was an adult film. Nic Roeg said he was attempting to, this is a quote, to push the structure of film grammar into a different area by taking away the crutch of time which the audience holds on to. What that actually means is that half the way through the film, it becomes completely incoherent. There is no mention anywhere in the film of the time span. There was originally one point which one of the scientists said, oh, we've been doing this for 2 months, and they cut it out. So there is no mention of time in the movie, and it does become very disjointed. There's also this lovely quote. This is from The Guardian just before the movie came out, and Nic Roeg said, I wanted to have a sign at the front of the cinema which said, all those who enter here, please come with an open mind. Don't expect it to come together in the way with which you are familiar. It's a different animal, and it breaks new ground. Now, basically what that was Nic Roeg's way of saying the film makes absolutely no sense at all.
Yeah.
And it is true that with the best will in the world, it is narratively incoherent. However, what's really interesting about it is the kind of the function that it serves in terms of David Bowie's career. It was 75 when they were making it, and Bowie had done Diamond Dogs at that point, and the Diamond Dogs tour had been this they tried to do the 1980 Floor Show. Correct me if I'm wrong, because you're more of a Bowie expert than I am. They tried to do the 1980 Floor Show. It actually ended up as the Diamond Dog Show, in which there was just Bowie on stage, and all the musicians were kind of like behind walls.
He had some dancers running about, didn't he, and wrapping him in streamers and things like that.
Yeah, but it was him acting, and he'd been attempting to sort of do movie music for ages, and he wanted to move into movies. So then he gets this part in this movie, and the story is that he is cast as an alien who is emotionless, who's not quite human. He had to put on a stone to play the role, which took him from 8 stone up to 9 stone.
Yeah.
Which,
he was skeletal, wasn't he?
Absolutely skeleton, and also we do get to see his body completely naked, as we'll move on to later on. But he did. It was like a Robert De Niro thing. He did put on an entire stone to play the role.
He looked nice too. I like a bit of meat on.
Oh yeah. But in playing the role, the weird thing was that they filmed the whole thing out in Santa Fe. It took them 6 months to film it. He was actually filming it for 4 months, and he then went on to kind of live the role of Thomas Jerome Newton for the next 2 years. If you look at Bowie's albums from around then, Station to Station, the cover of Station to Station is actually a still from The Man Who Fell to Earth. In fact, the cover of Low is a still from The Man Who Fell to Earth. Plus, the 12-inch single of John and Only Dancing with the other version of John and Only Dancing is a picture of him from the very end of The Man Who Fell to Earth. So his career and the movie kind of completely coincided, and they became one and the same.
And he saved a fortune on getting a photographer out, because he's just like, got another one off the video.
Got another one off the video.
Sorted out, pronto print, done.
Very simple question, which I know you're going to ask me. Does Bowie actually act any good in it?
Hey, the thing that's always occurred to me, like, does Bowie actually act any good in it? Any good in it?
Well, strangely, yes, he does. It's the one for... Immediately after this, Bowie made Just a Gigolo, which was terrible.
Bobbins.
Later on, he made Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, which was pretty poor. I mean...
It was better than Just a Gigolo.
Yes, I know.
Mind you, what isn't?
Very few things aren't. The only thing he's ever really been good in since then, and I'm not a fan of The Hunger, is he turns up very briefly in Into the Night. But in this, he actually does do well. We're going to play you a clip from the movie. This is the clip in which he what's happened is he has revealed himself to Candy Clark. He comes down to Earth, and if you've seen the film, you remember this. If you haven't, it's a bit complicated to explain, but he's come down to Earth. He's set up a business in order to make a load of money so he can make a spaceship to go back home. In the interim, he's fallen in love with down-at-heel waitress Candy Clark.
So he's not only gone out on the razzle, he's copped as well.
He's copped,
so
yes.
He's never going to go back, is he?
But to make it worse, having copped, he's gone into the bathroom where he has removed his nipples, his fingernails, and his the retinas of his eyes to reveal that, in fact, he's not a rutting stallion, but is, in fact, an androgynous alien.
Right.
He comes out of the bathroom, and this startles the hell out of Candy Clark.
But it's always the way, innit? I mean, you just get a nice low lights box of chocolate, you have silk jammies and all that. You take your fingernails, nipples and eyeballs out, and they're not interested, are they? It happens to me all the flipping time.
But she is fantastically understanding about it, and after having first totally wigged out, she calms down and says, okay, you're a space alien. Tell me about, your life. And he then goes in this very moving scene in which he tries to describe to her what his life was like back on his planet.
You must hate me.
No, I don't. I don't hate anyone. I can't.
Your wife's out there somewhere. She's waiting for you, isn't she? And your children, they must miss their dad. What do they like, your children?
They're like children. Exactly like children.
David Bowie in The Man Who Fell to Earth. And it is a good performance. I mean, it's not hugely apparent from that clip, is it? They like children.
Although that is exactly
like
but that is the performance that he does all the way through. It's deadpan, it's emotionless, it's flat, and that's why he's good at it, because that was the part that he was playing. The problem is he then carried on and did that at Victoria Station 2 years later and made a twit of himself.
He certainly did.
Some interesting trivial stuff. Firstly, David Bowie was only 28 when he made it, which I always find surprising because he looks about sort of 42. Cost £1.5 million, which at the time was a relatively large amount of money, although it was an international success. There are 4 different versions of the movie. It comes in 4 different cuts: 114 minutes, 117 minutes, 120 minutes, and 140 minutes.
And none of them makes perfect sense.
None of them make sense whatsoever. The 140 minutes version is the proper version. In England, it had an X certificate and it was uncut. The main reason it had an X certificate was that there was what was considered to be sort of rather racy sex scenes. It has to be said that at the time, some of the critics pointed out rather unfairly that Nic Roeg felt almost obliged to have it because he'd done Don't Look Now, which had the most famous sex scene ever committed to film, with Julie Christie and Donald Sutherland in it, which is, an extraordinary piece of work. And so
that's a good film, that, isn't it?
It is an absolute...
Which I mistakenly called Don't Look Back, which is because
which is a film about Bob Dylan, yes, running around Venice in a little red shawl. Returning once again to the fantastic Bare Facts. The Bare Facts, actually, I think in this case, reviews the uncensored version, but the American version, which I think is the 117 minutes version. If you're interested in this stuff, they said 58 minutes, David Bowie, we get brief buns while turning over in bed with Candy Clark, and then at 1 hour and 56, frontal nudity and brief buns in bed with Clark, don't see his face. However, from the version that I remember having seen, which is the 140-minute version, I think there's slightly more of David Bowie's Mr. Happy in that. Also, I think that you see Mr. Rip Torn's Mr. Happy in the fully uncut version. The only place where the movie was actually substantially messed around was in Italy. There is a line, which I can't put in context, but there is a line which in the original says that you don't look anything like my father, which was replaced with the line, I think my father is getting suspicious. I can't put that in context because it's too racy to do, but if you've seen the film in Italy, that's rip-roaringly funny, apparently. Nice. So I think it's significant that it demonstrates that Bowie actually did have some sense of how to work on camera, and since his career went downhill so badly after that, he was actually originally slated to star in The Eagle Has Landed directly after this movie, which is incredible. I mean, it never came off. And he was claiming at the time that he made it that Ziggy, and I don't know whether you may know whether this is true, that Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars was originally put together as a film script, but nobody would give him any money for it, which is why it ended up as an album. But for ages, he had always wanted to be a film star. This was the one moment when it happened. And seeing it again, it's a damn good film, and it does hold together despite its total lack of narrative cohesion, despite the fact that there are scenes in it which are shocking, such as the scene in which David Bowie remembers being on his old planet, and he remembers taking off in a spaceship to go to Earth, and the spaceship is quite clearly a garden shed on a piece of railway track. And I mean, it's like, how did that get across the galaxy? All that notwithstanding, it still works.